Tea time is hot time is monk time.
All right, hello there, thrill seekers. That was a little piece of a song by a band called The Monks, and that was Monk Time. And I usually don't use other people's songs, but there was no way I could cover that and do it right and do it justice. And that's what I want to talk about, Monk Time. Somebody asked me on the comments section of this YouTube channel, am I a monk? And looking through this, the previous videos I've done, I couldn't find a video where I specifically answered that question, but I know I have addressed everything I can think of that I'm going to address now, pretty much, in other videos. But there's not one specifically answering the question, are you, Brad, a monk? So I thought I would answer that question here. Now, I've already answered that question in print in a book called Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen, and the chapter in which I address this question is called, I'm Just a Zen Bozo. It's chapter 8, as you can see. And this is where I talked about that. I also talked about it in my book Hardcore Zen, but I think that it's maybe a little clearer in this book. So let me talk about what I've done, because the answer to the question, are you a monk, I can't give you a simple yes or no. In fact, this is the second version of this video I'm doing, because when I was doing the first one, I just got so bogged down in the details, it was just ridiculous. So let's see if I can avoid doing that this time. My teacher, Nishijima Roshi, told me I am a monk. And so if you asked him, well, he's dead now, so you can't ask him, but if you'd asked him when he was alive, he would have said Brad is a monk. However, I think according to most people's way of thinking, I am not a monk. And in the past, I used to sometimes call myself a monk. These days, I generally avoid that. But if you look through stuff on the internet, you can find things where I'm calling myself a monk. And I just dropped that because I found that a lot of people took the statement, I am a monk, as a challenge or something, and they would start arguing with it. And I just don't want to get involved in those arguments. I've done 3 ceremonies that would tend to, in some people's opinion, qualify one to be a monk, and let me tell you about those. When I first started practicing with my first teacher, Tim McCarthy, before I met Nishijima Roshi, he didn't do any of those ceremonial things at all. So there was never a question of becoming a monk, and I never had any intention to become a monk, so I didn't care. When I started studying with Nishijima Roshi in Japan, I noticed that a number of his students would walk into the place wearing this thing called a rakusu. And a rakusu kind of looks like a bib, and it's this little square of cloth you wear on your chest that hangs over your neck. And what it meant in their case was that they had taken a ceremony called Jukai. And Jukai is a ceremony where you publicly take a vow to follow the 16 Buddhist precepts. And I'm not going to go into what the 16 Buddhist precepts are because that would just make this video too long. And anyway, I have done the 16 precepts in each precept in a series of videos I did back about 3 years ago, I think. So if you want to go look through those, you can find them. But it's a public vow to kind of uphold the Buddhist ethical thing. I don't know what the Buddhist ethics. You publicly vow to follow Buddhist ethics for the rest of your life. And you get a little rakusu, as I said, usually, and you'll get a new fake name. And my fake name is Odo, which means the way of answers. It's often chosen by your teacher to sound a little bit like your given name, and I guess Odo sounded a little bit like Warner. I don't really think it does, but that's how it goes. In Nishijima Roshi's case, everything ended, all the Dharma names he gave, as far as I know, the ones I've heard people use, all end in do, which means the way, and then you have something else beginning with it. So, he was sort of constrained to have something that ends with do, and there's no good words that sound like a wa I could have been Wado, Way of Peace or something, but that sounds even worse than Odo. It sounds like Wad instead of Odor. Well, anyway. So I did that ceremony with him because he wanted me to do a Dharma Transmission ceremony, which makes me an independent teacher within his lineage. And it's a supposed recreation of an event that happened in the life of the historical Buddha, in which he recognized his teacher Mahakashapa as his successor. These days, in the early days, there was one teacher would leave one successor, and that had been kind of a tradition, I don't know if it was ever a rule, but it was sort of the tradition for a long time. And then sometime around when Buddhism entered China, in the Zen stream of Buddhism anyway, certain teachers, Bodhidharmas usually looked on as the first one who did this, but he probably wasn't really the first, But he gave his Dharma transmission to 4 students, and then Nishijima Roshi gave his Dharma transmission to I don't know, more than 20 of his students. So there's a lot of that. So when you say you're the Dharma heir, it doesn't mean you're like the single Dharma heir. But anyway, so I did that. And then when I decided to return to the U.S., I thought I might need to sort of shore up my position with the Soto Shu. And the Soto Shu is a big Vatican-like organization modeled after the Vatican that oversees things within supposedly Dogen's lineage, although Dogen... he didn't have anything to do with Soto Shu. It happened hundreds of years after he was long dead. So I thought maybe getting something official on their books was important, so I talked Nishijima Roshi into doing the Soto Shu Jukai ceremony for me, which would put me on the books of Soto Shu as a novice monk. And so I had to shave my head, I had to buy a bunch of special fancy clothes, including special Buddhist underwear. I'm not kidding. And do this ceremony, and I had to shave my head. Did I say that? I can't remember. Anyway, I had to shave my head. And I did it along with some other students of Nishijima Roshi's who were in a similar situation. They were going to go practice in their own countries, and this might help. Actually, it didn't end up meaning anything. Nobody cared. So I didn't really need to go shave my head and do that ceremony, but it was a fun experience, an interesting experience. So, I'm kind of glad I did it. Now, I've never lived monastically. So in the Catholic tradition, as I understand it, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, and if you want to, but as I understand it, becoming a monk is kind of a lifelong thing, becoming a monk or a nun, in which you take certain vows, including a vow of celibacy, and you go live in a monastery, and you follow the monastic rules for the rest of your life. That doesn't really exist in Japanese Zen Buddhism. I don't know whether or not it exists outside of Japan in, say, Korean or Thai Zen Buddhism. Because this is another thing that I should say here is a lot of people. I heard some comedian a few weeks ago say, Christians, there's like 97 varieties of Christianity, but there's only one Buddhism. Which is not true at all. There's probably more forms of Buddhism than there are forms of Christianity. Just a guess, I don't know for sure, but Buddhism has been around 500 years longer than Christianity, so it had longer to create schisms and sects and things like that. So I'm talking about Japanese-style Zen, Soto Zen Buddhism. And in that tradition, there isn't this idea of becoming a monk for life. I think there might be a handful of people or a few people out there who actually do that, who go into a monastery and stay there for their whole lives. But generally, monasteries in the Japanese Zen tradition are training places. So you go there and you get your training, and you live monastically for a certain amount of time, which is usually designated by your teacher or whatever you're trying to accomplish with it. I think the general amount is a year. And you do that, and then afterwards you become a temple priest. So this is where the distinction of priest and monk starts to fall into pieces. The reason I called that chapter "I'm Just a Zen Bozo" was because the Japanese word is bozu, and bozu, which sounds like bozo, doesn't really map strictly onto what we call a monk or a priest. So if you want to use those words, you're probably in the Japanese Soto Zen tradition a monk for your training period and then a priest afterwards. Because what you generally do is after you've done your training period in the monastery, you go out and you take over a temple somewhere. And at that point, you become something more like a priest or a pastor or something. I don't know what the words are in the Christian tradition, but you're just kind of overseeing this temple and, I don't know, helping people do whatever they do and running funeral ceremonies and all those kind of things. My friend Shozan Jack Haubner, who does a YouTube channel called Zen Confidential, which I highly recommend. I think it's really good. He probably would be more like what people think of as a monk, because he went to Mount Baldy, which is, I always point this way when I say Mount Baldy because it's somewhere back there. I don't live too far away from Mount Baldy. He went to Mount Baldy, and that's a monastery up there on the mountain, Mount Baldy, and lived there for a number of years with a shaved head and the robes and the whole bit, and doing monk things every day for, I don't know, you'd have to ask him how many years he lived there, but it was a number of years, and that's all he did. In my case, I never did that. I lived, the only sort of monastic living I ever did was I spent 6 weeks at Tassajara one summer, and that's a lot of people wouldn't even consider that true monastic living, but I think it is a form of monastic living, doing that sort of thing. But that's the longest I ever did it, and I've done, that was one of, I don't know, 7 or 8 times I spent a significant period up there. So I've done that, but not lived monastically like most people think. Now, Nishijima Roshi's idea of what constituted a monk was more an attitude. Like once you had taken those public vows and you had the attitude to uphold those vows, then you were a monk. So it didn't matter to him whether you had your head shaved or whether you lived in a monastery or wore the robes or any of that. It was more a matter of attitude. And people argue about this all the time, so this is why I dropped the idea of calling myself a monk. Now, I'd like to read you a couple of excerpts from something I found on the Antaiji page, which this is run by a monk, or what? I don't think he runs the Antaiji page anymore, but it was Muho Nolke, who's a German guy who was definitely a monk. He lived in Antaiji, and he was the abbot of Antaiji, which is a temple in Japan. And he translated this from Uchiyama Kosho Roshi, who was, I don't think Uchiyama was his direct teacher, but I think Uchiyama was the teacher of his teacher. And here's a few things he says about being a monk. He says, this is the title of this is, "To you who has decided to become a Zen monk. The motto for living in the world is eat or be eaten. Now, if you have decided to become a monk because you think that life in this world is too hard and bitter for you, and you would prefer to rather live off other people's donations while drinking your tea, if you want to become a monk just to make a living, then the following is not for you. If you read the following, be aware that it is addressed to someone who has aroused the mind to practice the Buddha way after questioning his own life or her own life, and only therefore wants to become a monk." And I think this is important, because when I first started doing this stuff, I had this kind of romantic notion of being a monk, that you could do that. You could just kind of live up there on the mountain and have an easy life and be profound and wise and whatever and not have to do any work. That doesn't really exist. And even to the extent where anything remotely like that exists, the problem for me is that it requires you to live off of other people's labor, so This is arguable, but it makes me uneasy. This idea that you're not really doing anything. You're just kind of up there in the monastery, and people are sort of paying for you to live there. I don't repudiate anybody who does that, because I think those people do serve an important function, and actually they work pretty hard, most of them. But I don't know. There was something about that. Maybe it's my Midwestern Ohio upbringing that made me think, oh no, you should have a job, These days I do live off your donations, so maybe I'm no better, which is why I don't really say that these people are bad, but it's one of the reasons I never chose to go that route back in the old days. I don't know, if I had the same attitude I have about it now, I might, if I could go back in time, which you can't do, choose to do that route. But I think it's important to understand that you don't do this just as a job, just as a way of making a living, or just as a way to kind of get away from the world. Because what I've noticed during the times that I have lived monastically is that people bring all their BS with them right to the monastery. So you're not really going to get away from it. Becomes like office politics and stuff. All kinds of stuff like that goes on in monasteries just as bad as it goes on in, offices or whatever sort of job you might have. So, you don't get away from that by going to a monastery. You kind of, supposedly you're with people who all have a kind of a vested interest in discovering their true nature. But I tell you what, sometimes I wonder about that. Sometimes I wonder how certain people got into the monasteries that I've visited, and enough about that. So Kosho Uchiyama goes on, for someone who has aroused this mind and aspires to practice the way, what is important is to first of all find a good master and look for a good place for practice. In the old days, the practicing monks would put on their straw hats and straw sandals and travel through the whole country in search of a good master. These days it's easier to find one, etc., etc. You should not forget, though, that to practice the Buddha way means to let go of the self and practice egolessness. To let go of the self and practice egolessness means to let go of the measuring stick that we are always carrying around with us in our brains. For this, you must follow the teaching of the master and the rules of the place of practice that you have decided for loyally. To the place, you have to loyally follow those rules, without stating your own preferences or judgments of good and bad. It is important to first sit through silently in one place for at least 10 years. So I'm going to skip down a bit, and he says, right from the start, you have to know clearly that no master is perfect. Any master is just a human being. What is important is your own practice, which has to consist of following the imperfect master as perfectly as possible. If you follow your master in this way, then this practice is the basis on which you can follow yourself. And he has a quote from Dogen Zenji, who says, following the master, following the sutras, all this means to follow one's self. The sutras are an expression of yourself. The master is your master. When you travel far and wide to meet with masters, that means you travel far and wide to meet with yourself. When you pick 100 weeds, you are picking yourself 100 times. And when you climb 10,000 trees, you are climbing yourself for 10,000 times. Understanding that when you practice in this way, you are practicing yourself. Practicing and understanding thus, you will let go of yourself and get a real taste of yourself for the first time. And Kosho Uchiyama goes on to say, the master does not exist outside of yourself. The practice of zazen, in which the self becomes the self, is the master. That means zazen in which you really let go of your thoughts. And then he says, does that mean that it is enough to practice zazen alone without a master or at all? No, certainly not. Dogen Zenji says, when you hear that you get a taste of yourself and awake to yourself through yourself, you might jump to the conclusion that you should practice alone, all for yourself, without having a master point the way out for you. That is a big mistake. To think that you can liberate yourself without a master is a heretic opinion that can be traced back to the naturalistic school of philosophy in India. So, This is one of the tricky things, and this is probably requires a whole other video. But the idea is that you have to have a master, but the master is yourself. This can be tricky, and this can be something one has to navigate. And I think that all of us who do this have to figure out how to do it. Because if you just blindly follow the master, that's no good. And that's a way to get into some really bad stuff, and you've seen all the stories about how that can go wrong and becomes culty and stupid and like that. So you're kind of trying to interact with the master in a way where you respect your teacher, and you learn from your teacher, and you follow your teacher, but you also follow yourself. You allow the teacher to spark something within yourself that shows you where the truth is. And you can't do this by yourself, and that's the weird thing. If you try to do it by yourself, you're always going to go wrong. That's just time tested. But if you work with another person, you have a chance of getting it right. So there you go. That is a complicated answer to a simple question, am I a monk? And the answer is, I don't know, maybe. I don't really care. Anyway, if you want to contribute to my monk's life, which I'm sort of living these days, because as I said, I'm living off donations, you can go to the URL that you're seeing on the screen below, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. There you will find links to my PayPal and my Patreon accounts. Those are my main ways of making a living, and I appreciate your support. But as always, you don't got to support me if you don't want to support me. All right, we will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Bye. I see that you've noticed I'm eating a bagel while editing this video, right? So you want a little snack too? All right, hang on. I'll get you something. Hold on there. We'll take you off camera, and then we'll get you some snack, okay? All right, let's go. Let's go.